I finally made it here. If you guys were following me on Twitter, it was a pretty intense day yesterday with the weather, shutting down Detroit Airport and so on. So I'm glad to be here. My name's Joel Langill. I recently joined the AECOM team back in July of 2016. AECOM is a company that builds infrastructure. So we do major projects in transportation, buildings, sporting venues, on and on and on. And every aspect of those actually has some cyber components, which has really kind of rounded my career out significantly, because I spent about 30 plus years putting in infrastructure around the world in countries that had none, like Chad and Cameroon and Algeria, and lots of time in Venezuela and Vietnam, places like that. So as I moved into this kind of new phase in my life, I started to split how I began working with clients, because half my clients tend to be around federal services. So the requirements of them tend to be very different than the requirements of the private sector. And it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion of what that is typically when you're working for the federal government, they really don't have a CEO or a board of directors that you have to justify to. So they tend to have big budgets, but they also have a lot of big requirements. So one thing that came about was trying to figure out what's not going the right direction. I went through several years where it felt like I was trying to hold up a wave, right? You obviously can't hold up a wave. It just goes right over you and around you. So the idea was to figure out where we may be making decisions wrong early in this process. So the idea on this particular chart was to kind of demonstrate what I really consider is the true kill chain of an event. So the idea here is that we all realize that we have threats. And these threats typically want to exploit weaknesses. Now, what's hard to see is there's a little pivoting wheel there. Typically, when you're in this part of an attack, you're going to be moving around both physical and cyber domains in order to leverage yourself to create the turning point, which is something undesirable. So, for instance, that could be the loss of safe drinking water, the loss of communications infrastructure, the loss of a rail transportation network. But the idea now is to figure out how this is going to go up and impact an essential service or an essential business function. Because the idea here is to get people to stop moving away from the vulnerabilities and to start focusing more on the impact to the overall business or service that's being provided. That's the true secret behind operational security. Because what we find is you make that curve on the bottom of the sine wave and you move from the left to the right, people are attacking cyber assets, but the reason they're attacking them, or the why, is really where the problem needs to be focused. So it's not that people want to attack a control system. The inherent value of a control system is insignificant in comparison to the physical assets that that control system is controlling. So let's take a defense-type control system, a weapon system. It's nothing more than a very, very, very high-tech industrial control system. But imagine what that particular weapon system is now doing. So the idea here is to get people to start considering now how we can focus not necessarily on what's wrong, but if something went wrong, why would somebody want to do it? And this is where we're starting to see, because it was nice with the crossing the chasm, is we're really seeing two different groupings of clients today. Those that believe this and are following it versus those that just want somebody to tell them everything to do. So one thing, I've been doing a lot of work recently in transportation, and primarily rail transportation, because we obviously know in the Northeast there's been a lot of incidents, and then of course very recently the derailment in Portland. Well, I'm actually one of the lead security architects on a couple major positive train control projects. And this is a very good example of where regulations are significantly falling short. And the reason I mention it is it's because they never gave thought to a diagram like this. So if you take a look at the positive train control, which is one of the CFR documents, 49 CFR 236, and it's got lots of subparts, there is one sentence in there that relates to cybersecurity. One. So this is supposed to be the system that is now going to save lives. But there are no cyber requirements within the regulations. So the idea here is that all they're worried about is that the messages that go between the wayside equipment, the rolling stock, and the office are encrypted. And you're kind of like, really? So think of the end. What business function or service does a train provide? The ability to move people between 2 points. So they never gave much thought to how you could exploit the functionality of the positive train control system, i.e. stopping a train. Stop a train in the middle of nowhere, board the train, mass casualties, a lot of people lose their lives. They never thought of the weaponization of a system to impact the far right. They were more worried about patient or passenger safety. The exact same thing happens in pharmaceutical. 21 CFR Part 11 is focused entirely on patient safety, and there were next to no methods, because of the way the regulations are written with all the out-of-band testing, that cyber could ever be used to taint a drug. So the problem is most of the pharmaceutical companies were not doing anything as far as cyber. But then when they started to look at system availability and uptime, i.e. business functions, they started to change over and turn a different leaf. So the idea here is to try to start to bring this together. And really what's interesting, so the question I pose for the group is, normally within an organization, people want to separate information security from physical security. So with all of your companies in here, how many people have a CISO that reports to a CIO? Okay. What about a CISO that reports directly to the CEO? And then the third case would be this concept of a CSO. In all my years of consulting, I've only found one company that actually has a CSO, and that team carries guns, protects the CEO and the board of directors, and protects the networks. Security is security. So when we talk about a counter trend, those companies that are really excelling, it's the companies that realize there are 3 very integrated domains that are all now in the cyber theater. The cyberspace, the logical space we could call it, the physical space, and the electromagnetic spectrum. The U.S. Department of Defense Cyber Command believes that the next battlefield will be in spectrum. So it's really interesting when you start to get clients that hire you, where we put as much emphasis on understanding the spectrum as we do the network. Yet you go into the demo room and you will see no one here that really talks about spectrum. And it's interesting because, again, we're not talking about 802.11. We're talking about the true gamut of the electromagnetic spectrum and how it can be used as one of the many means to actually compromise operational systems. So the Department of Defense has this one down. They definitely see the risk. But you look at what many people do, and a good example is the introduction of wireless technologies. So from a security perspective, somebody would say, hey, we got this great security, we got ISA 100. All these technologies provide a secure infrastructure. But the problem is the utilization of spectrum can actually cause denial of service very simply in those scenarios. So the idea with this was to try to show this very unique trend that we're seeing with companies. And I have a very large project that I've been working on for about a year where this is exactly their approach. We do facility assessments, we do physical assessments, we do cyber assessments, the standard vulnerability analysis, and we do an electromagnetic spectrum analysis. So this is now the trend where people are starting to move away from a document like 853 or 62443. Let's get it more specific, like 3-3, which is effectively a controls catalog, because all of those documents fail to look at this perspective. However, how many people in here have been to a recent Black Hat or DevCon? Okay, we got a few. The number one swag that you see at those events are lockpicks. So when we actually did an assessment on some major infrastructure, we found out that in order to break into a facility was a relatively straightforward step. Once we were in that facility, it generated an alert, and the Physical Security Operations Center would dispatch police to come get us. Typically took about 30 minutes. However, once we were in there, their entire infrastructure was exposed. So we were able to completely compromise the entire infrastructure and the network and all of the embedded devices, the substations that were on it, all of that because of this fact that they felt that it was physically secure when in fact it wasn't. So the idea now is to kind of create this paradigm shift. I love the word paradigm. But as Jeff was talking, it's definitely a three-way street here. We have obviously the vendors that make products. We have the integrators or the engineering construction type companies that put this stuff together, and then you have the owner-operator on the very end. Three very different aspects of the security cycle. But the idea here is that until clients require cyber, many vendors are not necessarily going to provide it just to provide it. So it's interesting, and it was cool to see how many people in here were following something like 62443, and we had a few hands. It's true. Probably 1 in 50 RFQs that comes across the bow actually has anything in here. Because typically they're commercial bids, and especially when you work in the public sector, commercial bids can be, they're very influenced on the bottom line. They have to be because of the organization. So the idea is that owner-operators typically push requirements. The vendors then would implement those requirements into their products and software solutions. Then the capability that you would extract from these products is something that you would do during engineering, construction, and commissioning. And then finally, the whole delivery of the solution falls back on the owner and operator. So the idea here is to show how we can do security by design, but what we really want to do is we want to tighten this circle so that we get resiliency. So that once something goes wrong, our system can tolerate bumps in the road, and that we can then address this problem. And that's why when we start to look at standards, I don't believe there is one answer. There isn't a global standard right now. The NIST framework is not globally accepted. Many of the leading countries have an equivalent type of document. And when I did the review on the NIST update, they were asking what we would change. And I said some more recognition of some of the other documents that are out there. So it's now time to turn this over. So I'll give it back to Sid.
Sid.